Steve, and good evening, everyone. I have to confess, first of all, that I am unashamedly emotional. 14 years ago, I met and lost my heart to Gistock, a 7-year-old ex-captive orangutan in the Tanjung Puting National Park in Kalimantan, Indonesian Borneo. Tonight, I'd like to share the story of how that singular meeting came in many years later to change the path that my life has taken. Orangutans share 97% of our DNA. They are sentient and intelligent beings, and they are Asia's only great ape. They're also on the verge of extinction. My story begins many years before when I read a book entitled Reflections of Eden, My Life with the Orangutans of Borneo by Biruta Galdikas. Now, she is the third of Louis Leakey's angels, or the primates as they became known, the other two being Jane Goodall and the late Diane Fossey. In 1971, Biruta Galdikas set off for the untamed jungles of Borneo to study this little-known and elusive great ape. The book is about her first 10 years in Borneo. And the book inspired my husband and I to take a journey and to visit the Tanjung Puting National Park where Biruta had set up camp first. And so, in June 1996, armed with our Lonely Planet guide, we set off on our adventure. It was quite a long and arduous trip from South Africa, and the internal flights in Indonesia were frankly scary. The last leg of our journey was on a very small aircraft, and it could only fly in the morning because in those days weather patterns were still predictable, and every afternoon there was a huge tropical thunderstorm, so the little plane couldn't go. When we boarded our aircraft the next morning, it was a very old one, and the panels on the inside where they were coming away from the walls had been stuck together with Band-Aid. And as we took our seats at the bulkhead, the emergency equipment was strapped onto the bulkhead in front of us, and that consisted of an axe and a small first aid kit with a typewritten yellowing paper inventory on what was enclosed, and there was a torch and a flare and some bandages and some Band-Aid, which I guess were the ones that were holding the plane together. So we weren't inspired with too much confidence at that stage. Nevertheless, we obviously arrived safely, and in Pangkalanbun we found a young Indonesian man who had some English and who was able to help us through the formalities of registering with the police and the forestry department and getting the necessary permits for the park. Because it's a peat swamp forest, you can only access Tanjung Puting National Park by boat. So we proceeded to the small port of Kumai, where we were able to charter a klotok, which is the local riverboat taxi. And we soon got to know why it was called that, because we after about a 2.5-hour journey up the very wide and muddy Sikonyo River, we turned off onto a tributary and entered another world. This was the beginning of the park area, and the water changed. Literally, you could see the brown water become this absolutely crystal clear, beautiful, tannin-coloured water. And our boatman, who was also our guide, switched off the engine, and we were able to just glide down this amazing waterway with thick rainforest on either side, listening to the sounds of the jungle and watching these amazing proboscis monkeys with their incredibly huge noses, rubbery noses, and long, beautiful tails, and they were staring at us from high above the trees. So, where am I up to now? Right, we've arrived in the Tanjung Puting area, and our first sighting of an orangutan was very brief. We were sitting quietly at a feeding station when suddenly there was a shaking of the trees, and out came this beautiful female orangutan with a baby on her shoulders. And she never let go of the branch of the tree. She just leant down, scooped up the bananas and stuffed them in her mouth, scooped up the bananas and gave them to her infant, another handful, and she was gone, back in this wall of wilderness as if she had never been there. The following day, we had a full day at Camp Leakey, which was the site of the first camp that Biruta had set up, and which was now open to the public. The access to this was a long boardwalk, and as we stepped off our boat and made our way down the boardwalk, we could see coming towards us from the distance an orangutan. And this was so incredibly exciting because he was coming closer and we were approaching each other, so this was going to be a close encounter. And our boatman knew exactly who he was. And I said, "Oh, can I touch him? I just wanted to feel his hair." And as he came up, he was about so high, and I bent down to touch him. Before I knew it, he had clambered into my arms and was, with all four hands, busily inspecting everything, my binoculars, my pockets, my hair, and this was my first encounter with Gistock. He continued to charm us for the rest of the afternoon, either following us high in the trees or behind us. The only place he didn't come with us was when we went into the jungle for a walk, and we realized that was because he knew we would come across Kusasi, who at that time was the king of the camp. He was the dominant male and had a magnificent cheek pads, and you certainly didn't mess with Kusasi. We went back to the jetty for our lunch, and sure as eggs, a few minutes later, there was Gistock again. And he just amused us for the whole afternoon. He was desperately trying to get onto our boat, which was moored next to us on the jetty. And he tried absolutely everything that he could. He would disappear, and suddenly you'd see a pair of hands appearing on top of the boardwalk, and then his face. And our boatman, who knew Gistock's antics, had literally could fend him off with a barge pole. Or he would swing right up into the trees, and he would swing from one tree to the other, and swaying, and you could see he was working out which of the saplings were pliable enough to take him over our heads and onto the boat. And he even ended up playing a game with my husband of match the leaves, and I'm pretty sure if we had had a Chinese checkers board, he would have mastered that as well. Needless to say, by the end of the afternoon, he had wormed his way into both our hearts. Fast forward 11 years, and it's 2007, and my husband and I have relocated to Hong Kong. And in conversation with a friend who was telling me about her life in Indonesia and how she had rescued an orangutan from a market near where she lived, of course, all my memories of our meeting with Gistock came flooding back into my consciousness. And I went home that night and I thought, I wonder what's happened to him. And I decided I was going to Google his name, as one did. And I Googled his name, and there were many websites, but the one, which was a very old website, was called Postcards from Borneo. And in it, a young journalist on her travels had written how she had come across this most amazing character, Gistock, but that he was being really badly treated and was being kept locked in a cage because of what he was getting up to. He was stealing people's food and so on. So I got quite upset, and I knew it was an old website, but I emailed the Orangutan Foundation International, based in Los Angeles, which is the foundation set up by Biruta, and I explained the situation and asked if they had any information on what had happened to him. And I got an email back asking for my telephone number. And then I heard nothing for a couple of months, until it was about November. Out of the blue, I got a telephone call, and it was Biruta herself. Well, I nearly fell off my chair. She said that she had wanted to speak to me personally, because she had some bad news to tell me about Gistock, and he had been beaten to death by the villagers for stealing their food. So, of course, I broke down in tears, and she was very upset as well. And when we managed to get ourselves under control again, we had a wonderful and long conversation of about an hour. And she was interested to know how come I had met Gistock and the circumstances. And I told her, and I also said to her that I would have loved to work with orangutans, but of course I had no qualifications. I wasn't a zoologist or a veterinary student or an anthropologist. And then she told me what had happened in the interim years, and said that Orangutan Foundation had actually opened a care centre and quarantine facility in Pasir Panjang, which is a very small village near where she lives with her Dayak husband. And this was in response to the overwhelming number of orphaned orangutans and displaced orangutans that had been brought to her over the years. And she said they had a nursery where they had little babies who just needed nurturing and loving. And why don't I come and volunteer for a month in Kalimantan? Well, for the second time in that conversation, I nearly fell off my chair, and I was absolutely so excited, and of course, very definitely said, yes, I would love to do that. And so I decided that I would plan for my trip for August 2008. It was the year that I was turning 50, and I thought it was a fittingly momentous occasion to celebrate. And so I began planning to go. It was difficult because the care centre is not open to the public, and there really isn't any information out there about it, how to get there or what the situation is. And I didn't want to phone Dr. Kaldikas and say, what's the situation? So as the day drew close to my departure, I got more and more nervous. I was incredibly excited, but I was very, very nervous at the same time. I didn't know where I was going to be staying. I didn't know the transport situation, what the facilities were, or anything. But in the end, clutching not my Lonely Planet guide, because that was no use, but my Indonesian phrase book and dictionary, I set off on the same voyage, and this time it wasn't such an arduous voyage from Hong Kong, and I arrived in Pangkalan Bun. I stayed in a little hotel in the town there for a few days as a quarantine period, and then I was able to go to the care centre. My accommodation was with a wonderful family who lived across the road from the care centre, and I was given my own room with a fan, and we had no running water and certainly no hot water, but I soon got used to the cold mandis, which is the traditional way of bathing. And finally I was taken across to the care centre. They had over 300 orangutans at the time, and they were divided into groups according to their age. We call them pondoks, or camps. And I was taken to the baby pondok and the nursery. Here there were 30 infants, or babies, ranging in age from 10 months to 3 years. And finally, I was taken to the nursery, where I was introduced to my 4 infants. And they were Sus and Maggie and Oru and Wendy. And of course it was just love at first sight. As the days went by, I came to know each one of them and each one of their little characteristics, completely individual characteristics. The days passed, and the time was filled with bottle feeding on demand, preparing food for the other orangutans, nappy changing, washing dirty bottoms, bathing and washing generally, playing and cuddling, and sometimes just resting. We also took them out on their daily excursions to the baby forest, where they were able to test their skills at climbing and swinging, and this was really the first step in the process of rehabilitation, which is a very long and slow one and can take up to 7 or 8 years. And so the month at the care centre passed in a whirlwind of emotion, from extreme joy and happiness and highlights, such as when Dr. Galdikas invited me to accompany her on a release of 7 orangutans who had completed their rehabilitation. It was just the most incredible and gratifying experience. To times of despair and frustration, and also great sadness when, for example, little Regina, who had just been brought to the centre a few days before, developed a fever and died. So my departure from the care centre was traumatic, to say the least. And when I got back to Hong Kong, I think I went through a period of mourning. I had come to know my babies as my Klingons, and I really, really missed them. I felt a deep and physical pain when I thought of them. And I was also sad because I felt that this long journey, which had started so many years ago, had come to an end. But I was wrong. It was only the end of part 1. I had seen at first hand the devastation and destruction caused by deforestation. Millions and millions of hectares of virgin rainforest destroyed to make way for palm oil plantations. And in the process, the peat forest exposed, the peat exposed, and millions of tons of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere, making Indonesia the 3rd greatest emitter of greenhouse gases after China and America. At this rate of deforestation, the orangutans will be extinct within 10 years. When the orangutans have lost all their habitat, they naturally, in search of food, desperate for food, stray onto the plantations, where they are treated as vermin and either shot immediately or beaten into submission. And if it's a mother with a baby, the mother is killed and the baby is ripped from her and sold on the black market. I couldn't just come back to Hong Kong and do nothing. And so I set up Orangutan Aid in 2009. I was inspired by the words of Paul Watson of Sea Shepherd, who said, "What changes the world for the better is the passion of certain individuals, not governments and not big organizations." So with Orangutan Aid, through education and an awareness program, I hope to inspire people in Hong Kong to take action and help to save Asia's only great ape from extinction. I was privileged earlier this year to speak at the Jane Goodall Institute's Asian Youth Summit, because I feel that the youth are the key to the future. And I've also spoken with several other groups since. I was also very lucky to go back to see my babies in May this year and take across the funds which we have raised through Orangutan Aid to this point and oversee how it was spent. And this is something that I intend to do on an ongoing basis. We are taught that decisions made based on emotion are irrational and therefore somehow wrong or a sign of weakness. But I hope that my story tonight has shown that that is not necessarily always true. Thank you.